It's great to be back at AUSA. When I first I came back from Ukraine, as some of you may know, I've spent the better part of the last 5 years in Ukraine, 32 trips, 180 days in the combat zone. And and saw things that I thought were relevant to not only our foreign policy, but the future of the U.S. military. And one of the first places that gave attention to that and discussed it was AUSA. And I was a true thought leader, I think, in the United States. Let me say that, in all humility, what I'm going to try and do this morning is be a little bit provocative. So anything I say, take as a hypothesis. As a professor, I believe in hypotheses. And I don't think we do that enough. We tend to talk in sort of sound bites and declaratives. So I would purposely try to be a little bit provocative. And to me, there's I don't think anything I'm going to say that's not open to debate and argument. So whether it's in the Q&A session, I'm happy to for people to give their own opinion, not just feel like they have to phrase it in a question or afterwards. I took the first. Does this run by myself? Yeah. One of the challenges I think we've had over the last 25 years is the Cold War ended, and you could say we won. And the embodiment of Sun Tzu, what's the ultimate form of victory? Get the other side to quit without a war. And we had a kind of heady hubris. We created a force, a U.S. Army, that we didn't end up using on the Russians, but did a very nice job in Desert Storm. And we felt very proud of ourselves. And in a grand strategy sense, the old threat seemed to be to have dissipated. And in fact, Russia had a huge force, 5 million men, sitting about well over half of that aimed at NATO and Europe, and it basically went away. So we were in a situation where our Navy could probably, at least in sequence, if not simultaneously, take on and defeat every other Navy in the world. We found ourselves with an Air Force that could fly just about anywhere in the world and do things that no other Air Force has ever done or could do. And we had an Army that had demonstrated that the effort that was put in, led originally by Bill DePue, a TRADOC following the '73 war, and then followed on by Dawnstar and a whole host of SAC years, of building American ground forces, had really demonstrated its qualitative strength in the storm. We look around, and Russia was in the cups. I mean, they were in deep trouble. China was on the rise, but we thought both Russia and China could be security partners. Maybe they wouldn't get it right away, but eventually they realized the advantages of having joining the international system and being security partners. Europe looked like it was going to be integrated whole and free and an independent and friendly pillar. There was a general sense that it was, I think even at the time it was a bit bombastic, but the end of history. We've ended great power competition, and now liberal values are, we believed in the commons in terms of space, in terms of freedom of the oceans, in terms of an international communication system now known as the internet. To the extent we were worried about threats, it was the lower end of the spectrum. And yeah, I think it's a fair critique to say that after Vietnam, we emphasized large-scale theater war and basically forgot a lot of the lessons about counterinsurgency we learned the hard way. But during this interregnum, we sort of did it in reverse. So we were off fighting counterinsurgency, and we sort of forgot the lessons of high-intensity theater war. Next slide. Oh, I guess do my own slide. I think a number of those assumptions are challengeable. Clearly, our military and particularly the ground forces are overstretched. Just look at deployments, look at divorce rates of troops. Europe, after Brexit, doesn't look quite as united as before. We have NATO members in Hungary, for example, that side with the Russians. We have a NATO member, Turkey, who certainly doesn't look like an ally right now. The Chinese are violating or endangering the global commons in terms of freedom of navigation. Both they and the Russians have used an extensive amount of effort in trying to break into the cyber domain, using it for intelligence and information warfare in a way that I don't think we anticipated. And both of them also kind of creating their own screens to try to protect their side of that. So all of a sudden now we're back to a full spectrum, but we've once again gone about 20 years with neglecting the ground forces in terms of high intensity war. And to me, when I was about my third trip to Ukraine, summer of 14, I had this just enormous sense of deja vu. I go, we saw this movie once before. It was called the '73 War. I mean, there were things that were different, so I'm going to talk about the Russian concept, and then I'm going to switch a little bit and hopefully end quickly on the issue of China. And I use the word syndicate in the title, mainly because I thought the word alliance was too strong. But a serious hypotheses I'd like to throw out and for debate, and hopefully by the morning panel and the afternoon panel, who have enormous expertise, respectively, on Russia and China, to bat this around. I think there is evidence that the Russians and the Chinese are, well, they use the term strategic alliance. In fact, 2 weeks ago, Putin made a big piece of it. But they've been talking about it for several years. What I've found when I raise that issue, and they're sharing intelligence, they're sharing weapons technology. When I raise that with people, they go, "Oh yeah, but that's just superficial. It won't mean anything. They hate each other and so on." And I get that reaction from both Russian experts and Chinese experts. So I'm not saying I'm right, but I think the evidence of that growing cooperation, wherever it may end, it may be a marriage made in hell, but it's an affair right now that might cause us some challenges. I think there's enough evidence that we ought to start at least thinking about it being a potential contingency as opposed to just dismissing it on sheer historicism or logic. And that's kind of my bottom line today. So just to summarize quickly, the Russians had 17 military districts at the height of the Cold War. They cut their forces back. They had 210 divisions. By 2014, they were down to a handful. They took a number of them and they wanted to create brigades and have them be an all-volunteer force. The problem is that they just couldn't get the enlistments. They couldn't pay for and attract what they call contractors, which we would call professional soldiers. So over half of and they went from a manpower force of 5 million down to less than 1 million in all the services. And so the Army was stuck with roughly half its manpower being conscripts. The conscripts didn't do well. First Chechen War, first of all, they're not treated well as recruits. They give beast barracks a new meaning in terms of how they're treated. They're not well trained. When they're in combat, they don't do particularly well. Then they take disproportionate high casualties. And oh, by the way, their mothers tend to complain. So a major innovation of Putin in the Second Chechen War actually had two innovations. One is he basically bought off 1/3 of the Chechens by making a strategic alliance with Karber. But secondly, they introduced only a battalion tactical group from each brigade. A battalion tactical group had essentially the best, usually the deputy brigade commander, sometimes even the brigade commander, and the professionals, the contractors, and put them into a combined arms unit that had not only infantry, but it had, for example, this battalion would have 1 or 2 companies of tanks. It could have 3 batteries of artillery, and they trained it would train it for 2 months. And then, in the first Chechen War and in the Georgian War, they didn't have this much. But by 2014 in Ukraine, what I'm describing was happening. So it was a fairly interesting, and it worked for them, even though smaller and tighter, on a dispersed battlefield, combined arms integration, and people, and their concept of combined arms integration at the battalion tactical group was different than what we would do in terms of cross attachment, where we, okay, I'll give you my company, my tank company, you give me your infantry company, and we'll use them for a week or 2 and then pass them back. They were training them initially for 2 months, and now it's up to 5. Initially, they could only field 1 battalion tactical group out of their 80-some brigades. Starting in 2017, they tried to field 2, and their goal by 2020 is to field all 3 out of. Now, how they're going to do that with conscripts is certainly another question. We talk a lot about hybrid war, and we just tend to describe them as hybrid war. And they use the term, but almost exclusively, they talk about hybrid as our concept to describe what we do. Going up to the Ukraine intervention, there was a flurry of Russian General Staff articles and material called New Generation Warfare. Once Ukraine started, the terms ceased to be used. I'm not sure why, but I think there's no evidence that it's been repudiated. And it has elements of hybrid in it, the Gerasimov doctrine, for example. But it also, what's interesting is a much larger bouillabaisse, a bigger stew than we tend to think of when we talk about hybrid. So yes, there's a low end, but there's also a high end. So in 2017, the Russians conducted one of their largest post-Cold War exercises of Pod 17, which was a conventional invasion of the Baltics and Eastern Europe. A few months later, in 2018, they ran another, and it was sort of interesting. A lot of people in NATO and even in the U.S. said, well, that's kind of old thinking, but they really want to do hybrid. To me, an explanation of what they're up to occurred in the spring of 2018. They had an exercise that they didn't hype and didn't talk about, which was the assumption of a hybrid conflict that they were in the process of losing or wasn't succeeding, and therefore they then needed to kick in. So it was, in essence, the front end of a argument for the Zapad exercise. So if you just take what's happened in Ukraine, there was the Crimean subversion activity, but then very quickly they pulled off one of the largest, most successful, fastest air assaults in recorded history. Put in a full brigade into Crimea in literally 24 hours, and assured that the Ukrainians couldn't respond. Successful in the sense not that they fought, but they didn't have to because they preempted any Ukrainian stuff. They took the number 2, number 3, and number 4 man who had organized the activity in Crimea and then moved them to the Donbass and started a subversive activity there. They then began taking over local government facilities, creating linking cities with roadblocks and more conventional forces, and essentially created a proxy war, putting in several thousand pieces, by the way, of heavy equipment. When it looked like the Ukrainians were about 2 weeks away from a win when they launched their counterattack in the summer of 2014, it looked like they were about 2 weeks from finishing off the separatists. The Russians directly intervened, attacking Luhansk and blew the whole southern front open. So it was a classic, major, large-scale attack, led or implemented by these battalion tactical groups. The Russians also discovered, though, that in the process, while they had broken through the front, these battalion tactical groups didn't have the higher echelon support, and they literally ran out of steam. And were vulnerable to Ukraine's most dynamic commander, Dabrowskis, who earlier had done the famous Dabrowskis Raid. He does a counterattack that essentially stops and stabilizes the front of the South. In the process of this, the Russians have also used nuclear threats. So Putin's bragged about putting the rocket forces on alert when they went into Crimea. So going into Crimea, wait a minute, you're calling it a DEFCON? We know that elements of that are true because ham operators picked up the Russians using the ultra-low frequency net to alert their strategic rocket submarines at sea, which would be like a DEFCON 4. On the other hand, they're always the peacemaker. They offer to have a ceasefire, Minsk, or be the good arbiters now in Syria. So it's this combination that's sort of interesting. Elements of that have been played around. So, as I said, in the summer of 2014, I had this strong sense of deja vu because I'd been with Dawnstar II when we were learning the lessons of 73 war. And there were a number of them. To the Army's credit, in the summer or fall of 2015, General McMaster was then running the Arctic, commissioned the New Generation Warfare Study led by Pete Jones. And they then did a very detailed and, I think, comprehensive analysis of what was going on. But it's sort of interesting to contrast. So Dawnstar II did his study. He was a brigadier general. He gets promoted, gets a corps, later commander in Tradoc. The Army studies on the 73 war were widely distributed throughout the Army and the other services and the Congress. What happened to the New Generation Warfare Study? It went into the safe. What happened to Pete Jones? He was not selected and retired. But I'm going to go fairly fast. Some of you may have seen these before. Certainly my report to McMaster and several others are available. If those who are interested, I'd be happy to give you extra. So some basic conclusions that I think come out. One is we are not going to be operating if we're going against the Russians and frankly the Chinese, we're not going to be operating in a benign airspace. What I've noticed in our weaknesses of our current ground forces, it's essentially I would argue it's essentially a function of who we were fighting. We weren't fighting guys with an air force. We weren't fighting guys with electronics, let alone electronic warfare. We weren't fighting guys with heavy modern munitions. So we weren't fighting guys who were using armor in any significant way. And we weren't fighting a war that was in high intensity. So we sort of focused on that and left some gaps in our own systems. The air defenses the Russians put in the Donbass basically shot the Ukrainian Air Force out of its own sky. Dense overlay of air defense systems. You look in the U.S. Army today, and I like Patriot, I'm certainly not going to demean it, but other than Patriot, you go, what do we have? We got Avenger. At least the last time I looked, how many Avenger units were there in the active Army? 1. The rest are all in the Guard. Okay, well, it's going to take longer to get more. How many were in Europe as of a year ago? Zip. We basically are acting like we're going to control the airspace, and I think that's certainly questionable. Rather than go through this in detail, I'll just, as I talk, you can sort of look at it. But I think we're going to be facing a situation where in the past we have been dependent on having secure airspace and being able to use air power. Now it's going to be challenged. That doesn't mean our planes won't shoot them down. It doesn't mean that we won't be able to get some decent sorties, but not like we're used to. I think one of the new things that was most surprising to me was the dominance and proliferation of unmanned aerial vehicles. They were ubiquitous and everywhere. And I think when you're in that environment, it dramatically changes how you act and think. If we didn't have any of our own, I think we ought to, or weren't employing that technology, we ought to still take the systems and go out and train our troops so they can understand what it is like to be under that level of surveillance. The Russians have used a lot. The one that's their longer range, the four-post, was they bought first leased and then bought from Israel. And oh, by the way, it does have ITAR controlled parts in it. I don't know how that happened, but it did. I know that because I looked at one the Ukrainians shot down. You can shoot them down, but for example, the Ukrainians have shot a number down with their Buk SA-17. The cost exchange ratio is about 30 to 1. So it's not, you're not on the right side of that curve. What's interesting is the Russians have created a concept called a contour, fire strike contour. In the Cold War, they had reconnaissance strike complex and reconnaissance strike engagement. The engagement was sort of at the tactical level, and the reconnaissance strike was essentially against fixed targets. What's interesting now is, without giving those concepts up, they've developed a very dynamic one that's really sort of interesting. So extensive use of electronic warfare. There are, and in the classic roles of electronic warfare, essentially blacking out opponent communications. By the way, the Harris radios, the few that the Ukrainians had, were able to bleed through. But nonetheless, you turn up the gain on your Harris, and now his ability to target you is higher, even if he can't intercept it. Secondly, using it for intelligence. Third, they've done some interesting things. Basically, the most effective anti-drone activity the Russians have used against the Ukrainians, and by the way, against our Raven UAVs that we gave the Ukrainians, is to either take them down or capture them and turn them around and use them on the Ukrainians. So these are screenshots I brought back from a Russian targeting computer. In the spring of 2016, they took the several general officers, a number of commanders, and troops from the artillery school in St. Petersburg, and combined them with essentially 3 artillery battalions, multiple rocket launcher, longer range fires, and shorter range howitzers, self-propelled. It brought them into Ukraine, ran an experiment for a number of months. And what they were doing is every army has the challenge, particularly with electronic warfare. Who controls it and how does it link? So the intelligence guys want it because they want to see what's going on. Your comm guys want to suppress them. What the Russians realized is that the person who has to control that is the fires guy. So they created a special cell called the Contour Group, and they can override and have control of all the UAVs in an area, and also override any available artillery. So they've been practicing this thing, and by using a multi-spectrum UAV, which is the shot there, they fly over and they can pick up concentrations of electronic. And they go, well, boy, there's a lot of cell phones, a lot of traffic in that area. By the way, they can also differentiate in that system between different military and so. But so you say, well, what's going on? Well, maybe it's a Sunday school picnic. Who knows? And you go, oh, wait a minute, I see a Harris coming through the. No, I don't think that's a church. They then can target it and practice targeting in 10 minutes. I would say that probably the average is closer to 15, but still a fairly fast robot. And do it. We can talk more about the details, but that is now being implemented. What was an experiment in 16 was practice in 17, and it is being implemented essentially in all Russian formations. I was coming back from Ukraine on one of the trips, and I was at Graf and watching NATO exercise, and I looked at one of our command posts. I go, well, I wouldn't last a half a day in Ukraine. no security, no camouflage, no deception. We are emitting about 10 times more than the Ukrainians do. I remember talking to the program manager for the command post a cellular net. And I go, you're going to have a Wi-Fi? And the commander says, yeah, it's really cool, you know. I go, what about them picking it up? He said, well, you know, usually our command posts are 8 to 10 kilometers behind the lines. I go, what about when they're at 2,000 feet above you? I just don't think we've been, and I don't mean to be critical, somebody will figure out a nice way to use it. But my point is we aren't thinking about them as tough competitors. And yeah, we do glow in the dark. If you are dependent on your communications, you're going to get hit, and hit hard. Back in the Reagan Administration, I was a strategy advisor to Secretary Weinberger, and we were very proud that we had a whole new series of munitions, FASTCAM, DPICM, top attack munitions. So I was shocked. And so we'd say, oh, the Russians have 3 times as much artillery, but we have these munitions which are 3 to 5 times more effective. Okay. So I was in Ukraine, and the Russians are using scatterable mines. They're using top attack munitions. They're using our equivalent of a super DPICM. They're using thermobaric. I come back, I was briefing in the Pentagon, and people are kind of dowering, like, why? And I said, you know, they've caught up. And afterwards, I asked Johnson, I said, everybody, did I say something wrong? Why all the scowls? And they go, they didn't catch up. They didn't just catch up. We got rid of all of ours. It couldn't have been a moral argument because we sold much of it to the Saudis. So if it's a moral argument, but we didn't sign the Princess Di agreement. Neither did the Russians or Chinese, by the way, both of whom are sharing this new munitions. But we said, well, we want to set an example, and Secretary Gates, and in the Bush administration, not the Obama administration, so we want to set the example. Now I know our troops, when they're on the receiving end of thermobaric strike, are going to feel morally superior, but it's a bad way to fight. Thermobaric. I put Gates' memo next to the morgue shot. It was on the 12th of July of 14. The Russians hit 2 Ukrainian maneuver battalions and basically made them combat ineffective with mass casualties. The commander was killed. The medical staff was killed. I was later talking to the deputy commander, and he goes, we have to invent, with this new intensity of fires, we have to invent a new level of triage. I said, oh, what's that? He said, well, that's when your troop comes up to you and he's on fire and he asks you to shoot him to put him out of his misery because the thermobaric doesn't stop until it gets to the bone. Both sides have enjoyed the Russian-made self-propelled gun howitzer, which can be used both in indirect and direct fires, .122 caliber. U.S. Army's talked about having a mobile protected gun. We just didn't seem to be able to figure out how to do it yet. The Russians use it as in direct fire to suppress defenses. The Ukrainians, because they didn't have any fourth generation anti-tank guided missiles that would penetrate Russian reactive armor on the tanks, used them as an anti-tank gun. But, you know, it's fairly light, so they lost a lot of them. But there is a trend as you go to this decentralized battlefield with combined arms at lower and lower levels. There's a real role for that. The U.S. Army, in its infinite wisdom, I say, by the way, when I make critical comments, it's not to be a boy critic. It is a sense of frustration. Spent $17 billion of the taxpayers' money on a system called Future Combat System, FCS. $17 billion. Did we get any? Nope. Was anybody fired or criticized or change in behavior pattern? No. But don't fret. Basically, that system is available in the Russian airborne forces today. It's comes in, I think, 22 tons, has a 125 millimeter high velocity gun. It's amphibious, it's air transportable and air droppable. So maybe we'll, if we're going to get along with them, maybe they'll sell us a few. Summary of the trends. I had people ask me, say, well, if the Russian fires are so devastating, why didn't they just clean the Ukrainian clock? And the reason is that of the forces of the 40,000 troops in the Donbass, Russian combat troops are only about a quarter, about 10,000 at the peak. So, and they have not given much of the new munitions or the contour system to the separatist unit. But by the way, separatist units are led by Russian officers, but they have not tended to share that with their ally. The Ukrainians had inherited huge stocks from the Cold War. And had been getting the process of demilling and getting rid of them, but they still had a huge number. By my count, Ukraine, although 5 years of war, has shot more tonnage of artillery ammunition than exists in all the NATO stockpiles on the continent. Everybody, the military reform in the 90s in NATO was based on three things: reduce force structure, go light, and be able to deploy light infantry. And that infected everybody. Light vehicles are vulnerable in this battlefield. It was a saying, even in the 73 war. I remember an Israeli colonel telling Starry and I, the first 3 days of the war, we couldn't get the guys out of the M113s. And after they had seen them washed out, we couldn't get them back in. Both sides, the troops are smarter than their military establishments. They ride on the top. And firefight starts or artillery comes in, you jump off and disperse. Or the other pattern is to actually have more than your squad mounted on two vehicles, which seems to also have a number of advantages we can talk about. Virtually every tank in the Donbass is equipped with reactive armor. This one, by the way, the Ukrainian Dabrowskis captured in his famous counterattack and brought back. But it was a Russian tank that had taken three RPG hits and an AT hit, no problem. I came back and I was briefing the Admiral Becker had me briefing the Joint Staff Intelligence, and I was talking about, hey, I saw some T-90s, and there were some guys from one of our intelligence agencies there, and they said, we have no evidence of T-90s, and I go, well, I was with a Ukrainian unit. We were overrun by them. Does that count? Oh, no, they're kind of hard to see from. So I put together a list. And the Russians were fairly selective in their use. In terms of what was confirmed and unconfirmed. But at times they were very decisive. They would, the average T-90 or now the T-72B3 could outrange Ukrainian armor at roughly twice the range. And you're getting some long range, still the average engagement range is probably 1,200 meters or so, but you're getting some long range shots up to 5 clicks on both sides. So the tank is back. The Russians have now come out with this active protection system that essentially sends out think of it as a little shrapnel that takes out the incoming ATGM warhead, and it seems to work pretty well. On the T-90, it was built into the turret, but the Russians have now a new version that's being exported all the way back to T-55s, which is an add-on kit that can go on just about anything. Whole new series of armored vehicles. A few of the battles I'll talk about. This was the Dabrowskis' famous raid. the longest armored raid in recorded history, went 270 kilometers, 170 of it, 470 kilometers, 170 of it behind the lines. And it showed that the Russians had a very difficult time reacting to it. Then when they broke through in the south, he did the counterattack. It was funny. I asked him afterwards, I go, you attacked him and took very high risk when he turned east and drove headlong into their attack. I go, why didn't you go into a defense? And he said the same thing the Israeli commander said to starting on the Golan. I didn't have enough force to defend. I had to seize the initiative and throw them off their game plan. In the Israeli case, the commander took a single brigade and swung around and took out two Syrian divisions. And when they realized that the Israelis were behind them, they actually left their vehicles and ran. There were Russian units. Guys jumped out of their vehicles with the engines still running and left them. Dabrowskis on that counterattack brought back more equipment than he lost from capture. Wes Clark and I were, when the Ukrainians invited me to go in the March of 14, I reached out to an old friend, Wes Clark, I wanted to do it as a bipartisan effort, and I'd known him since he was a major on Al Haig's staff at NATO. And probably the smartest thing I did in terms of, I personally believe in a bipartisan approach. But we sat down and sort of asked, what are we looking at? And so on the Central Front, in the old days, we had a fairly high density of force, 66 brigades over 700 kilometers. Roughly 1/3 that density in the Ukraine, and if you go up to the forces in the Baltic today, it's 1/3 of that, or 1/9. Now, yeah, the terrain's more constricted, but the trend is a combination of high intensity fires and low density, and that then has a significant impact on maneuver. By the way, as I said, the Russians felt like they had made a mistake in getting rid of echelons and not being able to have sustained, so they brought back a tank army. I'll show you. A little spelling there. I think that's PDF playing with my words, but I'll let you sort of summarize. So what's been going on? Well, the Russians have added, so at the height of the Cold War in the DDR, in East Germany, the Russians had 5 armies. 1st Guards Tank, 2nd Guards Tank, 3rd Shock, 8th Guards Army up, and 20th. 8th Guards and 1st Guards Tank, 8th Guards Combined Arms Army and 1st Guards Tank were opposite our 2 corps. At the end of the Cold War, they took them back to Russia and disbanded them along with 20 more armies. Well, since 2014, they brought them back. So, and I don't think it's accidental when they could have had any number of Army honorifics to bring back as a symbolic thing. It's sort of interesting, the ones that they brought back. So they brought back 1st Guards Tank Army. Hey, you guys watching? Remember us? Oh, they're back. And they're sitting there opposite the Belarusian border. I played in Zapad, both against the Baltic and against Poland. The 20th Army was up around Moscow. It's now been moved down to Ukrainian border. And they brought back the 8th Guards Army opposite Rostov and a whole number of other units. Ukraine's in the news a lot lately. And if you'd read it, you'd think the place was, the epitome of corruptness and incompetence and not worth having as a friend, or why do we bother other than to find employment for politicians' sons or something to whine about. That's not the Ukraine I experienced. That army had been ignored, and they went through a horrific period in 14 and 15. They were only able, when the Russians first came in, they were only able to field 10 maneuver battalions. Their definition of readiness was you had 60% of your manpower and 50% of your vehicles could get out of the gate. I mean, that's how bad things were. Today they have 62 maneuver battalions, 100,000 combat trained troops, and fought and held. And there's still a lot of fight in them. And you kind of wonder, well, if we're worried about security of Eastern Europe, wouldn't it be nice to have those guys on our side? Joe McMaster had asked me to put together sort of a scorecard a couple of years ago. And and I think briefed it here a couple of years ago. And I think the Army is making improvements in these areas with the enhanced forward presence, pre-stationing equipment, and in acquisition. So you talk to various PMs and you look at the Army budget, and there are remedial things in the budget. But you look at when is the IOC, and it's 8 years, 10 years. So we have this gap right now, and I'm not sure all the stuff we're spending money on is of equal priority. And one might want to think about saying, what can we do to close that gap, at least in some high key areas? I don't think it's healthy to have electronic warfare buried in the sub-basement of Cyber Command. I remember General Depew making a comment to me in the late 70s. He said, electronic warfare is in the process of becoming a combat arm, and we've got to start viewing it as a combat arm. So, 2 weeks ago, President Putin made a big speech and big comment about a strategic alliance with China. As I said, I found it surprising how easily that is dismissed by Western experts on both Russia and China. But people say, yeah, they're doing some intelligence sharing. Yeah, the Chinese are buying at least component and some systems from Russia. So if you'll bear with me for just a few minutes to kind of draw a link between this morning and the afternoon, I just thought I'd offer you a few comments on China as well. Chinese also have their kind of version of a new generation warfare. It tends to be a little bit more economic based than pure subversive based. But you go around, it's amazing. I've spent 5 years before Ukraine running around Southeast Asia. Between then and Ukraine, I was down in Panama looking at the canal. The Chinese basically control both ends of the Panama Canal today. The Navy says, we don't care because we have the Pacific Fleet, but you could try and get the U.S. Army into the Pacific and all our WRM and probably a good part of the Air Force. It would be nice to have the canal. And especially buying their way into many countries. One of the things they did was by the way, this is sort of their trend in their military. They've been dropping their old infantry units, and now essentially this slide stops in 2010. 2018, they've mechanized their entire force. They have a secret arms control agreement with the Russians. It's kind of interesting. You have a secret arms control agreement, which the two sides basically backed off the border. So the Russians used to have 60 divisions along the China border during the Cold War. That's down to about a dozen brigades. The Chinese had 7 or 8 field armies, and they've either disbanded them or moved them to the south. When I say they're amphibious, that means there's an amphibious element in those armies. That doesn't mean the whole army is amphibious, but their concept is a little bit like our structure at Normandy. You have units or subunits that are designed for amphibious landing, and they then seize a port, and then you bring the other stuff either by transport ship. It is interesting that the Chinese have announced that they are building increasing their naval infantry by 100,000. Like the Russians, they got rid of division, basically got rid of division headquarters and went to brigades. It's a process of mechanizing it. It's sort of interesting. 20 years ago, what were they talking about as sort of threat areas? South Korea and Taiwan. Starting 10 years ago, all of a sudden, South China Sea started taking on. They talk about the first and second island chains. It is not something that's an esoteric concept that the average Chinese hasn't heard. It is used almost daily in the various Chinese media. You'd have a better chance of having a Chinese man on the street be able to describe the first and second island chain and what that means for China's security than you would have the average American congressman be able to describe multi-domain fires. And yes, they've been building all these islands and so forth. At the same time, there was a shift. So during the Cold War, they had this concept that there was a huge, mega global war. Then afterwards, in the 90s, it talked about local war, but starting in 1999, they began to move to theater commands and created these 5 theater commands, and this was their concept for theater conflict. It's the growth of theater. It was interesting. At the same time, they did a reevaluation of the lessons of the beginning of the Pacific War and World War II. It'd been kind of almost a ideological argument. Oh, we tied down 80% of the Japanese army, and what the Americans did with the landings and stuff we're the ones who really tied up the Japanese. And oh, by the way, they didn't really need to use a nuke and stuff. And they also were very disparaging of the Japanese. What's interesting is starting around mid-90s, their historiography did 180 degrees. And they started admiring the first 6 months of the Pacific campaign. And their argument was the Japanese had it basically right. You use air power to drive the opposing navy out of the area. Then you do landings, seize aerodromes, seize ports, and restage. So in the process of 3 months, they basically captured the first island chain. And for 6 months, they captured the first and second island chain. Where they still critique the Japanese approach is the Japanese, because they inherited the Bismarcks as a participation in World War I, they'd already started out in the Pacific, and they were much more distributed. And the current PLA critique of that is, unless you're going to conquer the world, you got to stop somewhere. Well, you don't want to stop when you're so dispersed and your positions can't reinforce each other. So the first island chain is, I'll show you, the first island chain is to be controlled in a conflict, and then from there to the second island chain is the area to be contested. An argument they used, they said, you were in Vietnam, you had 500,000 men in Vietnam. You had strategic bombers in Thailand. You had nuclear weapons in Taiwan and in the Philippines. You had 2 carrier battle groups sitting right off our shore. You left. You're not coming back. That was your decision to leave, but you're not coming back. And that's the attitude. There's been a lot of talk about what they're doing in the South China Sea and building all these little islands. And the positions themselves are relatively vulnerable. I mean, it's a big effort, massive effort of infrastructure at all these islands. But I think there's a point that generally gets missed in it. The last time I looked, counted, went through and looked at both in the Spratleys and the South, there were 300 Chinese merchant ships or warships of 200 feet in length or larger. What's happening over the last few years is we're becoming habituated to a very large naval presence in that South China Sea. Not just combatants, but merchant ships. Why is that important? Because in the past, we'd say, oh, well, if they're going to do something in the South China Sea, we'll see them coming. They'd be coming out of Guangzhou, and we have 3 or 4 days to track them. Now they're basically within 24 hours of steam time to the first island chain. It makes a difference. And, of course, the A2AD. There's a controversy, and I do not want to get into it today, about how many nuclear weapons does China have. It's sort of ironic that, between the early 60s and over a 20-year period, they built and fielded, they tested over 30 warheads and fielded a number of 3 megaton warheads. And then according to our analytical community, the arms control crowd in particular, stopped. Haven't done anything since. Now, they've been building missiles like sausage, but There was recent a commentary in the American Arms Control community. They said, "Oh well, yeah, they tested a MIRV, but they don't have the fissile material to put on it." You go, really? Really? What happened to all that? Those old big air-delivered 3 megaton warheads. It's interesting. So, without any kind of prediction, if you take and MIRV out their current ICBM force and look at a reasonable posture with for DF-41s and both with MIRV and a rail and a road mount, a fairly small number, you can get somewhere between 300 and 600 RVs coming in the States. Now, so if you believe, or I think for the American Arms Control community and part of our intelligence community, it's an article of ideology. They know how many the Chinese have. I don't. I don't pretend to. And frankly, I don't think anybody in the West does. But the potential there for delivery is substantial. Back in the Cold War, when I was working for Secretary Weinberger, we sort of had this phrase. I'm sure most of you heard it. You know, well, there's high probability, or there's low probability, high threats and probable, but you still worry about the bigger ones. So you invest in them and you deal with it. So what's happened during the interregnum? Well, we've been down focused at the bottom. Where are the Russians and the Chinese focusing their effort? Right where we have not. Both of them are focusing on theater war. Now, why did I bring this up as a syndicate? Because I think there is a possibility that I haven't seen us talking about, at least in public, that if we get in a crisis with one of these guys, we may be also facing a crisis in the other, or they may be playing with them, or they may even be leading it, and we lean to this way, and then all of a sudden it pops out here. It's interesting that in the spring of 2017, for the first time in history, the Russian Far East Fleet sailed out of Vladivostok and showed up in the South China Sea exercising with the Chinese. Oh, that's kind of interesting. Oh, by the way, at some point in that a Chinese sub surfaces within range of a very close range, unexpectedly close range to one of our carriers. And there had been Russian aerial surveillance, and it looked like they may have been helping them out, passing information. Then the Russians are doing the big, getting ready for the big exercise on Zapad against NATO. Who shows up in the Baltic? A Chinese fleet. Are you kidding me? Both Xi and Putin have made a point of saying, using the phrase strategic alliance. A few years ago, I was at the end of the Cold War. I ran, I think, the only team that actually did sort of a lessons from the other side, and we interviewed 40 of the top 50 Russian general officers. It was very insightful. I've stayed in touch with several of them and found them professionally interesting guys. So I was having a conversation with them, and they had invited me to give a talk in Moscow. And a few weeks before I went, there was an article in the People's Liberation Daily. And I said, for the first time in 50 years, there's a pro-Beijing clique in the Russian General Staff. So I decided to have a little fun, so I had it translated from Chinese into Russian. And when I'm meeting with the Russians, I say, what do you guys think about this? Well, several of the Russian general officers I've known, and these guys are now older and retired, but still, it's not true. Like, I'm so really... So, we know what bastards they are. We were all out deployed in the Far East. No, it's not us. It's Shoigu and Putin. And you talk to Putin's advisors, senior guys, and for the last 20 years, he has essentially led a move to a Eurasian alliance. It's a major feature of his. So in one of those discussions, the general sort of a by the by, and he got, and the Chinese have, so the Putin guys in that conversation said, well, but what the Chinese need is secure petroleum. And so in a potential conflict. So they could get that with us and and they buy our technology, and that money, the money just from that, what they want to buy from us in systems, the list of systems they want to purchase, is enough for us to do our modernization and procurement for the next 10 years. I don't know if it's true or not, but that was the So in the process, one of the Russian generals says, "Oh yeah, by the way, they asked us if we wanted to have a joint strategic plan." I go, "You mean PSYOP?" I go, "Yeah." I go, my voice went about 3 octaves up. I go, "What did you say?" "We haven't decided yet." I think there are issues there that really raise some serious questions. And I'll end by stipulating, I'm not predicting it. I just think that there's enough there that it needs some more attention than it's getting. That's my summary. I'm happy to take any questions or kick me off the stage. Or any comments, feel free to.
Well, thanks. First of all, I think we do have time for a couple of questions.
Thank you very much. My question is, you just mentioned the Chinese fleet in the Baltic. How did they get there? The Northern Sea Route or the Suez Canal through Djibouti? And once they're there, given that interest in oil and gas and all the stuff they're doing on the Yamal Peninsula, do you see the Bering Strait as being the next South China Sea?
So I don't believe they came to the north. In fact, I'm pretty sure they came to the southern. The exact route, I honestly don't. And they only stayed for several weeks. It was a ship visit. So it just, but it was interesting, particularly at a time when the Russians are getting ready for this big exercise in that area. By the way, they and the Russians just held a huge exercise in central Russia, a joint exercise, which they describe as the most integrated interaction of their two forces in a common area. Other than, I don't think they're planning on invading Mongolia in that exercise. It's an exercise training area, but it was interesting. The Chinese have hinted at it, but the Russians have been declarative about it. So in the Zapad exercise 17, they actually moved units from the Central Military District all the way up into the Kola Peninsula, a lot. And also rebased air. They're putting in those facilities. I think they are banking on global warming, opening up that area and making it more interesting. The Chinese have talked about it generally in kind of economic terms of being able to open up a trade area. I'm sure Larry Wurtzel and a number of China experts can offer more insight into what they're thinking. But that's as far as I can.
Question in the back.
Hi. By the way, would you introduce yourselves? It just helps.
Lieutenant Colonel Travis Rule, Joint Staff Air Force Officer.
Yeah.
Sir, there seems to be an assumption amongst much of the Department of Defense that any war or any conflict with China and Russia is going to be short. And it also seems like they've aligned their asymmetries quite strategically at the sort of nuclear and large scale. So what in your opinion, is our reaction or our long-term plan to get us out of that problem, both in the long-term versus short-term war, and then also we can't just mirror image against their nukes versus our nukes. That doesn't make any sense, especially if, given the way we spend our resources.
Great question. I'll try and keep, I won't do it justice in the time, but so a couple things on short versus long. When I first week I arrived in Ukraine, our ambassador told General Clark and I, Clark asked him, "How long do you think the Ukrainians will fight?" He says, "Oh, they'll put a little symbolic thing in a couple of days, and then they'll think of a way to end it." Now I've been fighting almost 6 years. I don't think the Russians expected that. It's also interesting to remember World War I. Virtually every army involved thought it was going to be a 6-month campaign. And relatively short, decisive, kind of like the Franco-Prussian War, and not huge losses, not huge industrial, essentially wipes out a generation of European young men, bankrupts most of the major powers. So you don't know. You don't know. It is foolish to assume that short. I think. Now, it's always a balance. How much are you going to put in a reserve? How much are you going to defer? How much in readiness? And it's just a tough set of questions. I don't think we are anywhere ready for intense combat in terms of our existing stocks and the loss rates if they occurred on a scale that you see in Ukraine for more than several weeks. I'll leave it to you in the Air Force to tell me how much sustaining shackles and bombs and yeah, we got some old stuff, right? But how much new stuff do we have? The Army turned around when this administration dropped the Princess Di ban, right? The Army turned around. Well, it would either sold it or it's not a matter of digging stuff out of the stocks anymore. You got to build them. I remember talking to PM for replacement for DPICM, and it's going to be 10 times the cost that we bought that stuff in the 80s for. Okay, that's inflation, I guess. And it's going to be 10 years. And he said, I'm not even sure how I'm going to do it in terms of being able to meet the 1% fail rate. Every year I try and go back and read Sun Tzu just to, some people read the Bible, I read Sun Tzu. I'm not suggesting they're equivalent. But recently I've been struck because his argument is that the key to strategy is focusing on the essential. And the first step is to find out what's not essential and then not waste resources on it. And so I think some lessons that we need to learn is we tend to say, oh, the threat, spend more money. And I'm not against putting more resources into things at all. But I think the first question ought to be, what are we spending money on that is not absolutely essential? I think we have basically three armies, if we can lump the Marine Corps in with the Army. We have one that is rapidly deployable or intended to be and can handle insurgencies and small conflict. And then we have another army that was and still is focused on Europe. And it's going to be a couple division equivalents there. And that's a heavy army. And we have some units in the Pacific, but it's not even clear how we think about where they're going. Are they reinforcing Korea, or are they really for the fight on the South China Sea? I think there's some areas of technology. At first, when the Army came out with multi-domain ITIS, I was sort of skeptical. I go, yeah, this is just more hype, more words. But as I've looked at it and thought about it, and also thought the environments where they're talking about using it. For example, the Russian forces that they would bring against NATO have to go over basically only 4 or at most 5 rail nets. Each one of those rail lines has dozens of bridges that a 500-kilometer missile fired from either the Baltic or from Poland would take. Okay, the Russians have railroad repair stuff and so forth. Maybe they could do one bridge a line. 6, 7, 8 of those bridges? That army's not. Oh, you say, well, but they'll send them forward. They'll send them ahead before the war. Get all deploy it forward, which is not the way the Russians currently do it. Which gives us, by the way, substantial warning if reaction time if we decide to use it. Okay, how are they going to sustain it? Because in the old day they had tons and tons of stocks forward. They're not forward now, so that army is still dependent on rail. It's the same with the Chinese in the Pacific. They steam out of Guangzhou and head south, or even come out of those islands. Anti-ship surface-to-surface missiles go both ways. Yeah, they can scare our carriers back, stand out of, and make them less efficient in terms of sword generation. But if you put ground forces with a multi-domain missile on Mindanao, you can essentially hold that Chinese fleet, depending on, of course, the number, and do the same thing to them. So there really is some interesting, innovative ways. And I've become, instead of a skeptic, a kind of enthusiast. On the other hand, the IOCs are too long. We don't have we got to develop new stuff. So one last comment on I think our procurement system is broken. At the end of the Cold War, we basically did away with much of competition by downsizing so much. Yes, we have competitive bids, but who's getting who? Half the guys are on each other's teams. And it's not just a competition. So, for example, it was reported last week that Russia's sending S-400s to Serbia. I don't know if it's true or not. I know that because they were delivered several months ago, they gave Belarus S-400s. Gave them. I don't know how much they're charging the Turks. Well, they're using that technology as a foreign policy security system. And they're not asking people to pay for it, or certainly offset it. Are we doing that with Patriot? No. The Baltics and Eastern Poland definitely need Patriot. Maybe the Poles will be able to afford it, but certainly the Baltics won't. And can't we take a page out of what the Russians are doing and think about it? I'm not for giving stuff away, because you can ask allies to do things for you. Have host nation support, take care of your equipment, and so forth. So I just think the whole system, and the Army has said, the last two chiefs have said, I'm going to reform the acquisition system. I was on the Army Science Board in the late 70s, and they just asked me to come back, but I don't think we've even started. And I don't think we can wait 10 years. So one last question. I'm sorry, you've been standing. I'll make my answer short.
We have one last question.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Good morning, sir. Colonel Paul Bates from the British Army.
Yeah.
Your premier ally. I was waiting for the Canadians to bite there, but going on from what you've just said there, and a part of your answer that you sort of gave there, the Army has 6 stated modernization priorities. Not all of those priorities can be the priority. So if you were to rack and stack them in order, where should the U.S. Army be focused, particularly against your concept here of theatre, war, and strategic alliance? And when you look at the strategies that are formed against those, they're separated out into a pacing threat and then a longer-term threat, where you would merge those together. So which one would you think that the U.S. Army should be backing first? I'm only asking that because we want to pile in on the right horse. So I'm going to pick several at different spectrums in both cost and time. So immediate and spend as much as you have to get competitive in electronic warfare and get it into the field, into combatant units, and do your version of a contour strike. No matter how much money you spend, it will save you in lives, and it will give you it'll keep you in the competitive game. It used to be a competitive advantage. Now we're not in that game, or we're very weak. And along with that, which isn't a high expense deal, is given emphasis on OPSEC, camouflage, deception, the field craft that we all knew back when we were facing somebody who would take advantage of it. And that stuff is training. That stuff is as much mental and physical in a behavioral sense than it is spending vast amounts of money on it. So on the other extreme, I think the Army has it. They have the construct right of a multi-domain. To my knowledge, they're looking at 3 different range missiles, and you probably need a range of those missiles. It would be nice if you could not have 3 separate ones, so you can have some degree of commonality and so forth. To my knowledge, right now, not one of them is planned to have a nuke on it. I go, really? It's ostensibly to help our guys in Europe against SS-26s with an extended range, which the Russians not only have the warheads for, but and we wouldn't put a nuke on. By the way, when Daddy Bush and Yeltsin made the agreement on the mutual unilateral reduction in tactical nuclear weapons, we went from something like 10,000 to 300 around B6, and we got rid of ASW, air defense, standoff missiles, 155 artillery, 8-inch artillery, Lance. The Russians retained 2,000 and another some number in deep storage, which are older. And they modernized those 2,000 warheads, and they brag about it. We haven't even modernized the B-61 in 20 years. There have been 4 or 5 efforts to try, but it always runs into something. In the current Congress, the very people who are complaining about the administration are trying to hold up having a nuclear modernization for tactical low yield. So it's not just the missile. It's. I'm not arguing that it ought to be all nuke. I just think if the other guys have dual capable options, something's wrong if you unilaterally forego that. In the middle, if you go with this concept of 3 armies, I think our heavy force. I don't like what the Army's restructured personally. I mean, it's just a personal. I think the armored cav, the old armored cav regiments, were ahead of their time, or they were just dot on for high intensity dispersed operations, and we ought to bring them back. Several. No, you don't have to change the whole word, but I think we can certainly use 3 of them. Your force in the Pacific. So it's interesting. We led the world in armed attack helicopters, but don't look. The Russians are stealing a lot from our old playbook, and are going very big into armed attack helicopters now. The Chinese have an order for 2,000 attack helicopters, and they're just came out with their new ship, a helicopter ship. In the Pacific, I think the role of helicopters and air mobility still has a major role, particularly on the first island chain. And again, it's an area that we were leaders in, and we sort of forgot some of that. And yeah, in a high intensity, tight battlefield with heavy air defenses, helicopters, you take heavy losses. On that wide dispersed area, I think there's still a role. And so that would be my third. And air defense.
Well, Dr. Karber, thanks very much for that. You truly have set a stage for us, and I suspect we will hear some feedback on some of your comments over the duration of the day. But ladies and gentlemen, please, let's thank Dr. Karber for getting us off to a great start.